The dining room table was set for 9, but only 5 of us were sitting down. My older sister, Brenda, had spent 3 hours laying out the good cloth napkins, the ones with the hand-stitched borders our grandmother brought from Ohio 40 years ago. She had placed the brass candle holders right in the center, flanked by 2 bowls of potato salad that were slowly sweating under the ambient heat of an August evening. Everyone was acting like this was a dinner party. That was the trick. If you call people over on a Sunday at 5 in the afternoon, put out cold cuts, and ask about their kids, you can pretend you aren't about to strip someone of their inheritance. "Pass the mustard, David," my brother Richard said. He didn't look at me when he asked. He looked at the bowl of potato salad, then at his own thumb, which was tracing a pattern on the wooden edge of the table. I handed him the jar. "Here." "Thanks." My Uncle Mark cleared his throat. He was the eldest surviving male on my mother's side, a title he took with a terrifying degree of solemnity despite having spent 30 years running a mediocre dry-cleaning franchise. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, picked up a yellow legal pad that sat incongruously next to his dinner plate, and clicked a retractable ballpoint pen 3 times. Click, click, click. "All right," Mark said, his voice dropping an octave into his public speaking register. "We've all had a chance to eat a little something. I think we need to address why we're here tonight before it gets too late." Brenda folded her hands over her napkin. "It's about Mom's wishes. That's all this is. We just want to make sure Mom's true intentions are carried out." "Mom's intentions," I repeated softly. I kept my hands under the table, resting on my thighs. "Don't take that tone, David," Brenda said instantly, her chin snapping up. "We all suffered. We all spent the last 14 months driving back and forth to the hospice care center. Richard took off 4 Fridays in a row during tax season. I bought her groceries every Tuesday. You were there too, of course, but you lived 10 minutes away. It wasn't the same burden for you." "I took her to every single one of her radiation appointments, Brenda," I said. My voice was even. I had practiced keeping it even in the car on the drive over. 32 trips. "Because you have a flexible work schedule," Richard chimed in, leaning forward over his plate. "You freelance. You make your own hours. The rest of us have traditional jobs with actual stakes. If I lose a client because I'm sitting in an oncology waiting room, my family doesn't eat." "Is that what we're measuring?" I asked. "Stakes?" "We aren't measuring anything," Uncle Mark said, tapping the legal pad with the back of his pen. "We are looking at the realities of the estate. Your mother had $84,000 in her checking account. After the funeral expenses, the headstone deposit, and the outstanding balance on her medical insurance copies, there is roughly $62,000 left." He stopped, scanning the page like he was reading a corporate ledger. "Then," Mark continued, "there is the Metropolitan Prudential Life Insurance policy, $1 million. The room went completely still. The house was an old build, constructed in the late 1970s, and you could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen as the compressor kicked on. "1 million, Brenda repeated. She sighed, a long, weary sound meant to communicate how exhausting it was to contemplate such a figure. "Mom brought that policy into the marriage when she and your father were still together. But as we all know, your father checked out mentally 20 years before he actually passed away. He wasn't around for the tough years. He wasn't here when Mom broke her hip in 2018. Dad paid the premiums on that policy out of his own account until the day he died 5 years ago," I said. "From funds that belonged to the family unit," Mark corrected pointedly. "Legally, yes, his name was on the checking account, but morally, that money belonged to the collective household. Now, your mother never updated the paperwork after your father passed. We all know how she was with administration. She hated forms. She hated talking to brokers. She assumed the family would handle it when the time came." Richard cleared his throat again. He pulled a piece of paper from his inner jacket pocket and slid it across the table toward me. It wasn't a formal document. It was a printed sheet of standard printer paper with 4 handwritten lines at the bottom and 3 signatures already inked in blue. "What is this?" I asked, looking down at it. "It's an agreement," Brenda said. Her voice softened slightly, adopting that cloying, sympathetic pitch people use when they're trying to coax a child into taking bitter medicine. "We talked about it, Mark, Richard, Aunt Sarah, and me. The fairest way to handle the life insurance payout is a 4-way split. 25% each to the 3 siblings, and a 10% stake held in a family trust for the grandkids' college funds, with the remainder covering Mark's administrative oversight. I read the text on the paper. I, David Miller, hereby agree to waive any claim of sole beneficiary status regarding policy 884A92 and direct all disbursements to be pooled into the Miller family estate account for equitable distribution. You wrote this? I asked. Mark drafted it with his accountant, Richard said. It's clean, it keeps things out of probate court. If we go through probate, the state takes a huge chunk, the lawyers devour the rest, and we're left fighting over scraps for the next 3 years. Nobody wants that. You want me to sign away the policy? I said. We want you to do the right thing, Brenda said firmly. You've always been detached, David. You live alone in that small apartment. You don't have kids. You don't have a mortgage. If you walk away with $1 million, it changes your life, sure, but it doesn't build a legacy. Richard has 3 kids heading toward tuition age. I have 16 years left on my home loan. Mark is looking at retirement. It makes no sense for one person to hoard money that was meant to sustain the whole family. Meant to sustain the whole family, I repeated. I reached out and touched the edge of the paper with the tip of my index finger. And what if I don't sign? The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The forced warmth drained out of Brenda's eyes, leaving behind something cold and sharp. Richard straightened his posture, crossing his arms across his chest. Uncle Mark stopped tapping his pen. If you don't sign, Mark said slowly, we will be forced to file a petition with the probate court contesting the beneficiary designation on the grounds of undue influence and cognitive decline. I looked at Mark. Mom wasn't cognitively impaired when the policy was established. She was 78 when your father died, Mark replied without blinking. She was taking prescription sleep aids. She was isolated. You were the one visiting her 3 times a week during that period. A judge looks at a scenario where one child receives 100% of $1 million payout while the other 2 get nothing, and the judge asks questions. Was David exerting pressure? Was David managing her mail? We have texts, David. Texts from 2021 where you mentioned taking her to the bank. I took her to cash a $20 check, I said. It doesn't matter what the check was for, Brenda snapped. It establishes control. Do you really want us to drag Mom's name through court? Do you want a lawyer digging into her medical records, talking about her memory lapses, airing out everything just because you're being greedy? Greedy, I said softly. Yes, greedy, Richard said, his voice rising. You're sitting there acting like you're the favorite son. You think because you hung around her kitchen drinking tea while the rest of us were out working real jobs that you earned $1 million. That money belongs to the family. Dad built that foundation for all of us, not just for you to play around with your little photography business. I looked down at the table. For months, they had been making subtle comments. At the funeral home, when we were choosing the wood for the casket, Brenda had pulled me aside to ask if I knew where Mom kept her financial box. At the post-funeral reception, Richard had asked me 3 separate times if I had located the title to Mom's car. They hadn't been grieving. They had been performing an inventory. I brought someone with me, I said. Brenda frowned. What do you mean, who did you bring? He's sitting in his car down the street, I said, checking my wristwatch. It was 5:22 p.m. I told him to give us 20 minutes to see if we could have a normal conversation. David, what are you talking about? Mark asked, his brow furrowing. Who is in a car? I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen twice, and put it back in my pocket. His name is Arthur Vance, I said. He's an estate attorney from Vance, Miller, and Sterling. Richard let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. You brought a lawyer to Sunday dinner? Are you serious? You're hiring legal counsel over a family agreement. I didn't hire him today, Richard, I said. I hired him 3 weeks ago. Actually, that's not entirely true. He was retained 5 years ago. By who? Brenda asked, her voice tight. Mom didn't have a retainer with any firm. No, I said, she didn't. The front doorbell chimed. It was 2 quiet, polite rings that echoed through the hallway. Nobody moved for a second. Richard looked at Mark, expecting his uncle to take charge, but Mark just sat there holding his retractable pen, his eyes narrowed at me. I'll get it, I said, pushing my chair back from the table. I walked down the narrow hallway of my mother's house. The framed family photos hung along the plaster wall, us as kids at the lake, Richard's high school graduation, Brenda in her white wedding dress. My face was in those photos, too, usually off to the side, standing slightly behind someone else. I opened the front door. Arthur Vance was standing on the porch. He was a tall man in his early 60s, wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked entirely out of place against the faded green siding of my mother's house. He carried a leather briefcase that showed scuffs along the bottom edges, the kind of bag owned by a man who spent his life in courtrooms rather than boardrooms. "Evening, David," Arthur said calmly. "Arthur, come in. They're in the dining room." "How did it go?" "They handed me a waiver," I said. "They offered me 25% if I play nice and threatened to sue for undue influence if I don't." Arthur offered a brief, dry smile that didn't reach his eyes. Predictable. I led him down the hall into the dining room. When we entered, Brenda had already stood up. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, her posture rigid. Richard remained seated, but his face had turned a mottled, flushed red. Mark was frantically scanning his legal pad as if trying to find a clause that covered unexpected guests. "Everyone," I said, standing near the doorway, "this is Arthur Vance." "Mr. Miller," Arthur nodded politely to Mark, assuming he was the head of the table. "Ms. Miller, Mr. Richard Miller, good evening." "This is a private family matter, Mr. Vance," Mark said, his tone icy. "David has made a gross error in judgment, bringing an outside party into a private discussion regarding an unprobated estate." "Actually, Mr. Miller," Arthur said, placing his briefcase flat on the edge of the dining table right next to Brenda's linen napkin, "the estate is not unprobated, and this meeting is not private in the sense you think it is." "What are you talking about?" Brenda asked. Her voice cracked slightly on the word what. "Mom's estate hasn't cleared probate. We haven't even filed the inventory with the county clerk yet." "Your mother's estate consists of the checking account, the residential property, and her personal effects," Arthur said. He unlatched the silver clasps of his briefcase with 2 crisp clicks. "The total value of those assets is under $200,000. However, the life insurance policy you were discussing moments ago, Policy 884A92, is not part of your mother's estate." Richard slammed his palm on the table, making the glasses rattle. "Of course it's part of her estate. It was her life insurance. She was the insured." Arthur reached into his bag and pulled out a thick, blue-bound folder. He laid it flat on the wood. "That is where you are mistaken," Arthur said smoothly. "Your mother was indeed the named insured on the original document drawn up in 1994. However, in November of 2018, the policy underwent an irrevocable ownership and beneficiary transfer." Brenda stepped forward, her hand reaching out toward the folder. She was 76 years old in 2018. "She didn't have the capacity to make irrevocable transfers. We will contest it." "You can't contest it, Ms. Miller," Arthur replied. He didn't move the folder away from her. He simply rested his palm on top of it. "Because your mother didn't execute the transfer." The room went dead silent. Richard looked from Arthur to me, then back to Arthur. "What do you mean she didn't execute it? Who executed it?" "The policy owner," Arthur said. "Your father, Thomas Miller." Mark frowned, his pen hovering in midair. "Thomas died in 2019. He was completely detached from the family finances long before that. He had nothing to do with her accounts." "Your father," Arthur said, turning a page inside the blue folder, "was the primary policyholder and sole payer of the premiums from October 12, 1994 until his death. Under the original terms of the contract written with Metropolitan Prudential, the policyholder retains absolute right of assignment. In October of 2018, 11 months before his passing, Thomas Miller exercised that right." Arthur looked directly across the table at Richard, then turned his gaze to Brenda and finally settled on Mark. "Thomas Miller did not leave the policy to your mother," Arthur continued, his voice dropping into a steady, unyielding rhythm. "He converted the structure into a third-party irrevocable trust. He named himself as the original grantor, and he named David as the sole, unalterable beneficiary upon the death of the insured." Brenda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at Richard, waiting for him to object, to say something logical, but Richard was staring at the legal document Arthur had just flipped open. That can't be right," Mark stammered. "Tom wouldn't do that. Tom loved all his children equally. Why would he exclude Brenda? Why would he exclude Richard? Richard has 3 kids." Your father left a specific directive attached to the filing, Arthur said. He reached into the back pocket of the folder and withdrew a single sheet of cream-colored stationery. I recognized the paper immediately. It was the heavy paper my father used to keep in the top drawer of his oak desk in the basement. Would you like me to read it? Arthur asked quietly. Nobody answered. Brenda took a slow step backward until the back of her legs hit her chair and she sat down heavily. Richard's hands dropped into his lap. Mark just stared. I'll take that as a yes, Arthur said. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began to read. Arthur held the cream-colored sheet between his hands. The yellow light from the dining room chandelier hit the paper, casting a pale glow across the faint blue lines of my father's precise handwriting. The note is dated October 14, 2018, Arthur said, his voice measured and dry. It reads as follows. To whoever opens this when the time comes, I am making this change with a clear mind and full awareness of what will follow. For 30 years, I watched my family divide itself into takers and caretakers. When I was sick in 2015, David was the only one who slept on the floor of the hospital room while Richard went on his scheduled cruise and Brenda argued about who would pay for my home rehabilitation care. When their mother began to fail, I saw the same patterns repeat. I am not leaving this policy to my wife, because I know she will be pressured by Richard, Brenda, and Mark into dispersing it to satisfy their demands. I am transferring complete, sole ownership of policy 884A92 to David. He is the only one who showed up without asking what was in it for him. This is not an inheritance, it is a protection. Whatever he chooses to do with it is his right and his right alone. Arthur carefully folded the letter along its original crease and placed it back into the blue folder. He let the silence settle over the room for 3 long seconds before snapping the folder shut. The click of the metal clasps sounded like a starter pistol. That's a fake, Brenda whispered. Her voice was thin, but her eyes were fixed on the folder with a sharp, dangerous intensity. That's a complete fake. Dad didn't write like that. He never spoke like that. The letter was witnessed by 2 notary publics at the county courthouse, Ms. Miller, Arthur said smoothly. The handwriting was verified by a certified forensic document examiner 5 years ago when the trust structure was finalized. The carrier, Metropolitan Prudential, accepted the transfer, and the policy has been held in an irrevocable vehicle ever since. An irrevocable trust? Mark breathed out, the yellow legal pad slipping slightly on the table. He locked it down 5 years ago. Correct, Arthur said. Which means your mother never owned the policy at the time of her passing. It was never part of her estate. It does not pass through probate. It is not subject to family claims, and no waiver signed tonight, or any other night, has any legal standing whatsoever. Richard sat frozen. The deep red flush that had crept up his neck during Arthur's entrance had drained away, leaving his face pale and gray. He looked down at the printed waiver he had slid across the table earlier. It sat right between his napkin and the bowl of cold potato salad, a useless scrap of paper with 3 signatures that meant absolutely nothing. You knew, Richard said, turning his head slowly to look at me. His teeth were clenched. You knew the whole time. I looked back at him. I found out 3 weeks ago, Richard. After Mom passed, Arthur called me. Dad left instructions for Arthur to contact me only after both of them were gone. You sat here, Brenda said, her voice rising, shaking with a mix of fury and disbelief. You sat here while I laid out this dinner, while we talked about Mom's medical bills, while we tried to figure out how to pay for her headstone, and you knew you had $1 million in your pocket. I didn't ask for any of this, I said quietly. And I didn't hide anything. You called this meeting tonight to corner me. You brought a legal waiver to a Sunday dinner, Brenda. You sat me down and told me I was detached, that I had no stakes, that my life didn't count as much as yours because I don't have a house or 3 kids. Because it doesn't, Brenda yelled, slamming her hands onto the table. You live in a 1-bedroom apartment. You take photos of birds and empty buildings for a living. Richard has a family. I have a home to maintain. Mark spent 20 years keeping this family together when Dad checked out. Dad didn't check out, Brenda, I said, looking her dead in the eye. Dad pulled back because every time he entered a room with you 3, you were measuring what he had left. You treated his decline like an early liquidation sale. How dare you, Mark said, standing up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. How dare you speak to your family like that? I am your uncle. I took care of your mother's affairs." "You managed her dry cleaning bills, Mark," Arthur interrupted gently, stepping forward and tapping a single finger on his briefcase. "And if I may offer a word of legal caution, Mr. Miller, as the designated executor of the non-trust portions of the estate, you have a fiduciary duty to process the remaining $62,000 in your sister's checking account, according to her standard will. If you attempt to manipulate those funds to compensate for the insurance policy, my firm will immediately file for an emergency audit of the estate." Mark froze. He looked at Arthur, then at the blue folder, then back at his own legal pad. The pen in his hand gave one final, helpless asterisk click asterisk. "This is insane," Richard muttered, pulling his arms back onto his lap and staring down at his plate. "This is completely insane. $1 million to one person." "Dad didn't leave it to me so I could flaunt it, Richard," I said. "He left it to me because he knew if he left it to the group, you would tear each other apart trying to decide who deserved the biggest piece." "So what now?" Brenda spat out, her cheeks stained red. "You're just going to take it all. You're going to walk out that door, take $1 million, and leave your own brother and sister with nothing." "I haven't decided what I'm doing yet," I said. "Oh, please," she sneered. "Don't play the saint. You brought a lawyer to prove a point. You brought him here to humiliate us." "I brought Arthur here because I knew what this dinner was," I replied, standing up from my chair. "I knew you weren't inviting me over to talk about Mom. You invited me over to strip me of whatever was left, just like you tried to do to Dad before he died." Arthur smoothly retrieved the blue folder, slid it into his briefcase, and snapped the locks shut. The crisp asterisk clack echoed through the heavy silence of the dining room. "We will be submitting the final claim paperwork to Metropolitan Prudential tomorrow morning," Arthur announced, his tone entirely businesslike. "The disbursement will clear into an escrow account within 5 business days. If any member of this family attempts to file a frivolous injunction, please be aware that the trust contains a no-contest clause funded specifically to absorb and counter legal challenges. All legal fees incurred by David will be drawn directly from a secondary reserve set up by his father." Richard let out a bitter, lifeless laugh. "Dad set up a legal defense fund against his own kids." "He knew you," I said simply. I turned away from the table and began walking down the hallway toward the front door. Behind me, I could hear the quick, frantic sound of chairs dragging across the floor. "David, wait." It was Brenda. She rushed down the hall, catching up to me just as I reached the entryway. Her hair was slightly disheveled, a few strands pulling loose from her neat clip, and the hard, commanding edge in her face had melted into something desperate and frightened. "David, please," she begged, reaching out to touch my elbow. I stepped back, letting her hand drop into the empty air between us. "You can't do this. Think about the kids. Think about Richard's boys. They're your nephews. They didn't do anything to you." "I know they didn't," I said. "Then talk to us," she pleaded, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper so Arthur, who was waiting quietly by the open front door, couldn't hear. "We don't have to involve the lawyers anymore. Forget Mark's paper. Forget the waiver. Let's sit down, just the 3 of us, sibling to sibling. We can work out something fair. A real split." I looked at Brenda. For years, I had watched her manage every family gathering, every holiday, every crisis with the same cold, calculating efficiency. She wasn't asking out of love. She was negotiating a loss. "Fair?" I asked softly. "Brenda, when Mom was in hospice those last 2 weeks, do you remember what you asked me in the hallway outside her room?" She blinked, confused. "What?" "You asked me if I knew where she kept the key to her safe deposit box," I said. "Her heart rate was 40 beats a minute, and you were worried about a safe deposit box." Brenda opened her mouth, but no words came. Her eyes shifted away from mine, darting toward the floor. "I'm leaving now," I said. "David." "I'll be in touch through Arthur," I said, stepping past her and pulling the front door wider. The cool night air of late August washed over me as I stepped out onto the porch. Arthur followed close behind, his scuffed leather briefcase tucked neatly under his arm. Behind us, the front door stayed wide open for a few seconds, throwing a rectangle of yellow light across the wooden porch steps, before Brenda slammed it shut with a force that rattled the glass panels in the frame. We walked down the driveway in silence. The street was quiet, lined with dark oak trees and parked sedans. The crickets were loud in the lawns, filling the warm air with a steady, monotonous hum. When we reached Arthur's car, he paused, leaning his arm on the roof of the vehicle. "You handled that as well as could be expected," Arthur said, looking at me over the top of his glasses. "They're going to try something else," I said, looking back at the dark windows of my mother's house. "They can try," Arthur replied. "But your father built a fortress around this money, David. Legally, they have no ground to stand on. The policy is yours. The money is yours. The only question left is what you intend to do with it." I pulled my car keys out of my pocket, feeling the cold metal between my fingers. "My father left me a letter," I said. "There was a second page, wasn't there?" Arthur's gaze sharpened slightly in the faint street lamp light. He didn't answer immediately. He looked around the quiet suburban street, then opened his car door and picked up the briefcase from the passenger seat. "Your father instructed me to give you the second envelope only after you walked out of that house," Arthur said quietly. He pulled a thin, cream-colored envelope from the side pocket of his bag and handed it to me across the top of the car. It was sealed with red wax, completely blank on the outside, except for my name written in my father's cramped, angular scrawl. "What's in this, Arthur?" I asked, holding the envelope in my hands. "That," Arthur said, getting into the driver's seat, "is between you and your father. Call my office on Tuesday morning, David. We'll finalize the trust transfers then." The car engine started with a low purr, and Arthur pulled away from the curb, his red taillights fading down the dark street. I stood alone on the pavement outside my mother's house. Inside, through the thin curtains of the dining room window, I could see the dark silhouettes of 3 figures standing around the table, arguing under the low yellow light. I slid my thumb under the wax seal of the envelope and broke it open. The paper inside was thin, almost translucent, as if my father had torn it from an old pocket notebook he kept tucked away in his tool bench. I unfolded it under the pale white light of the street lamp. "David," his writing began, slightly shakier here than on the formal legal statement Arthur had read aloud. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, your mother is gone, and you have just stepped out of a room filled with people who claim to share your blood. I hope you didn't yell. I hope you didn't beg them to see your side. There is no point in trying to explain color to people who only look at the world through numbers. The money coming to you is real. It is clean, it is whole, and it is entirely yours. But money is an odd thing, David. In the hands of a weak man, it is a weapon to strike at others. In the hands of a bitter man, it is a fortress to hide behind. I do not want this money to become your fortress. I did not set up this trust to make you rich. I set it up to make you free. Free from the weight of having to prove your worth to a family that only valued what could be extracted from you. Free from the obligation to burn yourself out to keep everyone else warm. Inside the blue folder Arthur carries, there is a third document. It is a conditional directive. You have the full, legal right to ignore it and take every single penny for yourself. But if you want my final piece of advice, here it is. Do not keep all of it. Set aside what you need to live comfortably, to buy a small place of your own, to work on your photography without worrying about next month's rent to breathe. Take half. Take $500,000. As for the remaining half, do not give it to Richard, Brenda, or Mark in cash. They will only spend it, resent you for having given it, and ask for more when it runs out. Instead, instruct Arthur to place $500,000 into a restricted, blind educational trust for Richard's 3 children and Brenda's daughter. Set it up so that not a single dollar can be touched, managed, or redirected by their parents. The funds will trigger automatically only when those kids turn 18, and only for tuition, housing, or starting a business. Bypass the takers, David. Give it straight to the ones who haven't had the chance to become like them yet. The decision is yours. You owe me nothing, and you owe them nothing. Do what allows you to sleep peacefully at night." "Dad." I stood on the quiet asphalt, the faint paper rustling in the warm summer breeze. I read the words a second time, slowly, letting the ink settle into my memory. Across the lawn, the front door of my mother's house clicked open again. Richard stepped out onto the porch. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. His tie was loosened at the collar, and he had his hands jammed deep into his trouser pockets. He looked smaller out there in the dark, standing under the weak yellow glow of the porch light, stripped of the bravado he had held at the dining room table. He didn't run down the steps. He just stood at the edge of the porch, looking down the driveway toward where I was standing near my car. "David," he called out. His voice lacked the booming, authoritative edge it had earlier. It sounded tired, almost hoarse. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and slid it into my jacket pocket. "Yeah, Richard." He walked down the 3 wooden steps and stopped at the foot of the driveway, keeping a 10-foot distance between us. He looked at the empty street where Arthur's car had been parked just moments before, then looked at me. "Is he really gone?" Richard asked quietly. "He went back to his office," I said. Richard took a deep breath, looking up at the dark canopy of the oak trees overhead. "Brenda is inside tearing up the dining room. She's talking about calling 4 different estate lawyers tomorrow morning. Mark is sitting at the table trying to calculate how much he can charge the estate for his administrative hours over the last 6 months. He let out a short, hollow laugh that drifted away into the night air. "And what are you doing, Richard?" I asked. He looked down at his shoes. "I'm thinking about tuition," he said softly. "Ethan starts high school next year. Ben is right behind him. I've been working 60 hours a week for 4 years, David. 60 hours. Every time I think I'm getting ahead, something breaks. The roof leaks, the furnace goes, medical bills stack up. When Mark called me last week and told me about Mom's policy, I felt like I could finally stop drowning for 5 minutes. "So you decided to push me under instead," I said. Richard winced. He didn't defend himself. He didn't point fingers at Brenda or Mark. He just stood there in the dark, his shoulders slumped. "I panicked," Richard said quietly. "I looked at you and I saw someone who didn't have the weights around his neck that I have. I convinced myself it was unfair that you got the lifeline while I was the one pulling the load. I know how that sounds. I know it's wrong, but that's what happened." "Dad knew you were drowning, Richard," I said. Richard looked up, his eyes widening slightly. "What?" "Dad saw everything," I said. "He saw the pressure you were under. He saw how Brenda managed her fear with anger. He saw how Mark used control to pretend he was important. He knew all of it." "If he knew," Richard said, his voice cracking, "then why did he lock us out?" "Because he knew if he gave you the money directly, you'd use it to pay off the immediate fires, and then you'd be right back in the deep end, fighting Brenda over who got more," I said. "He knew you. Burned through it trying to satisfy a life you can't afford, instead of fixing what was actually broken." Richard didn't answer. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the harsh realization washing over him. "What happens now, David?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Is this it? Is the family over?" I unlocked my car door with a small asterisk beep of the electronic key fob. The headlights flashed once, cutting through the shadows of the driveway. "The family as you knew it, the one where everyone sits around a dinner table pretending to care while waiting for the accounting. That's over," I said, opening my driver's side door. "It's been over for a long time, Richard. You just didn't notice because you were too busy counting plates." "David, please." "I'm calling Arthur on Tuesday," I interrupted, standing by the open door. "We're going to finalize the paperwork." "And what are you going to do?" Richard asked, desperation creeping back into his voice. "Are you taking it all?" I looked at my brother, really looked at him. I saw the dark circles under his eyes, the gray creeping into his hairline, the posture of a man who had spent 15 years running on a treadmill that never stopped. I saw my father's eyes looking back at me from his face. "I'm doing what Dad asked me to do," I said quietly. "Nothing more and nothing less." "What does that mean?" "It means your kids are going to college, Richard," I said. "Every single one of them, fully paid. Housing, tuition, books. They won't have to take out loans, and they won't have to beg anyone for a dime." Richard froze. His hands came out of his pockets, hovering in the air between us as if he wanted to reach out, but didn't dare cross the space. "What?" "An educational trust," I explained, keeping my voice flat and even. $500,000 locked until Ethan turns 18. It will be managed by Vance, Miller, and Sterling. You won't have access to it. Brenda won't have access to it. Mark won't even be allowed to look at the paperwork. It goes straight to the kids." Tears sprang up in Richard's eyes, sudden and silent. He took a step forward, his chest heaving as he swallowed hard. "David, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," I said, stepping into the car and resting my hand on the steering wheel. "And don't thank me, thank Dad. He was the one who cared enough about your children to make sure you couldn't ruin their future while trying to salvage your own. What about Brenda? Richard asked, wiping his face with the back of his hand. What about her daughter? She gets the same deal, I said. Half of the educational fund is set aside for her. Whether Brenda accepts it or spends the next 10 years suing an airtight trust is up to her. The money will sit there waiting for her daughter regardless. And the rest? Richard asked softly. The other $500,000. I looked at the dashboard, then back out the open window at the modest suburban house where I had grown up. The place where my father had spent 30 years quietly laying the foundation for a rescue operation none of us saw coming. The rest stays with me, I said. I'm buying a small studio near the coast. I'm going to set up a darkroom, and I'm never sitting through another Sunday dinner in this house again. I pulled the door shut, locking out the sound of the night. Through the glass, I watched Richard stand at the end of the driveway. He didn't run back inside to tell Brenda. He didn't whip out his phone to call Mark. He just stood there in the faint glow of the street lamp, his hands hanging at his sides, staring at the ground as if a massive, unbearable weight had just been lifted off his chest, leaving him completely unsure of how to stand up straight without it. I started the engine, shifted into reverse, and backed out onto the main road. As I drove away, the red taillights of my car reflected off the darkened windows of my mother's house, fading into the distance until the street returned to complete, undisturbed darkness.